Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I am your host, Rashmi Chanduraj, founder of Arkstone Capital Partners, and I'm really excited to be your host for today's session, where we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of 1031 exchange and how to maximize returns and really minimize taxes. If you've ever sold an investment property or been hit with a big tax bill, or you're planning to sell or wondering how to keep more of those gains and compounding to you, this is going to be like super valuable, for you. At Arkstone, we help high-income, professionals, especially those of you who are in medicine or tech or finance, or business owners, really build long-term wealth through real estate while keeping more of what you earn. And one of the best ways is to do this with 1031 exchange. I'm thrilled today to have our guest, Greg Burns. Greg is a Southern California native and a senior vice president with Investment Property Exchange Services. With I think over 25 years of experience, he's helped thousands of his clients and tax advisors across the country use proven, and might I say, cutting edge 1031 strategies. He's an expert in every type of exchange, whether it's delayed, simultaneous, reverse, improvement, or multiple asset. And he works nationwide through the IPX national network. Today, we're actually going to be diving into sort of the fundamentals of 1031s, all the avoidable pitfalls, timelines, passive options like DSTs, and how these strategies can kind of, fit into your estate planning goals. So without further ado, get your pen, notebook, iPad, whatever it is that you take notes. We're going to go walk, right into it because there's going to be a lot of, actionable insights. Greg, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you with us today. Let's get things off with, really with the big picture, right? For those of us who haven't quite started exploring 1031s or, started but are afraid to take that step just because it can be daunting, what exactly is 1031 exchange and why is it such a powerful strategy right now?
Yeah, so 1031 is a section of the tax code. Actually, exchanges have been around for more than 100 years. But 1031 is section 1031 of the tax code, which allows someone that owns property that they've held for investment or business use to sell that property and exchange it for another property that they intend to hold for investment or business use. And the ultimate goal of that is to defer the capital gains taxes from the sale of that property into the replacement property. So kind of what you were talking about earlier is allowing yourself to use money that you would have normally paid in taxes to go leverage yourself into other properties where you can, compound that and make more money with it.
Yeah, that's great. And just building all that, from your perspective, what are some of the, biggest sort of missed opportunities you see when investors take, either they really don't take advantage of what these exchanges have to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I get calls from people all the time that are like, oh, I, closed on my deal a month ago and I talked to my CPA and I didn't realize what I was going to pay in taxes. I think that that's kind of a people don't really understand, they think, okay, well, capital gains tax is 15% and that's what I'm going to pay in taxes. But what they don't realize is there other taxes associated with the sale of that property, right? So you have recapture depreciation tax, you have healthcare taxes. Many states have taxes, New Jersey, New York, California being some of the highest. And so really effectively, most of my clients end up in the kind of mid 30% range if they sell an asset and decide not to do an exchange. So, and you have to get an exchange set up prior to your sale closing. And so we get lots of clients right now because there's been such a huge run up in the market over the last, 10 to 15 years that said, oh, well, I wasn't going to do an exchange. And then I talked to my CPA and realized I was going to pay in taxes. So I decided I wanted to do an exchange. So I would say, the biggest missed opportunity, and also understanding what you can accomplish with 1031. We're going to obviously do a much deeper dive into that as we kind of go along here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially now that we've covered kind of the basics, and let's, dive into what you talked about. Obviously you've sold your property and, at this point, can you, opt to do a 1031?
So as long as we're set up prior to escrow closing, you can get an exchange set up. If escrow is closed and you receive the proceeds, you aren't able to. So when they wrote the code, they basically said that during the exchange period, which starts the date that escrow closes, the client that's selling the asset or the taxpayer can't have control of the funds. So that's why you need to use a company like ours, a qualified intermediary that can basically, we act like a kind of like an escrow between the sale and the purchase, holding on to the funds. So you've got to get it set up. They're very easy to get set up. I mean, I have a client that was working with earlier this week that just said, I'm not sure that I want to do a 1031, but we know you only charge us $1,000, so we're just going to open it up and go ahead and look for that 45-day period to see if there's something out there that we want to buy. If there's nothing that we find that we love, we'll go ahead and pay our taxes, but at least will give us the opportunity to go look for 45 days.
Yeah, perfect segue in terms of, talking about timing, because I think this is one place that people get tripped up, right? Especially around the 45 days and the 180-day window. Can you walk us through what these deadlines are and what they mean? And, how can investors sort of be better prepared, instead of sort of making these rushed decisions and investing poorly on their asset just because they want to meet this 45-day window?
Yeah, so I would say obviously the 45-day identification period is but the hardest part of the exchange. When people call me and they'll say like, what advice can you give me, about doing an exchange? I always say, well, you need to work with a professional that understands 1031, that understands what you're trying to accomplish. Because selling an asset, because it's highly appreciated, is not a very good strategy because everything else out there is also highly appreciated. It was kind of like, 2 years ago, I called my wife and said, hey, we got to sell our house. Have you looked how much it's worth? And she's like, okay, that's fine. We can sell it, but
Yeah.
go find us somewhere else to live. And I realized that everybody else's house has gone up just like mine, right? So
Yeah.
I'm buying and selling in the same market. So the question becomes, what are you trying to accomplish by doing the exchange? And so are you trying to build your portfolio? Are you doing it for, cash flow purposes? There's a list of things that you obviously, want to look at. So you want to make sure that you're trying to accomplish a goal and you're not selling it just based off price. And then the second thing is you want to be aggressive early in the exchange. So, you only have 45 days from the date that escrow closes, basically to identify that property or properties that you want to purchase. You can sell one, buy multiple properties. And then you have another 135 days after that to get it closed. So it's a total of a 180-day period. So you basically, the 45 days is what they give you to find the property that you want to buy. Then they give you another 135 days after that to get it closed.
Oh, no, that's great. Let's just, talk about that a little bit more with an example. So let's say I've identified, or I know that I want to do a 1031 because I see the benefit. I've not identified the opportunity. Am I able to go identify multiple multiple opportunities that, like, because I don't know if, that's going to close or not. But
Yeah.
how do I navigate that?
Yeah, so there's a couple rules that where you can identify properties. There's a 3 property rule, which allows you to identify 3 properties. But there are clients that want to sell properties and buy multiple replacement properties. And obviously then the 3 property rule may not work for them. I had a client that sold some vacant land in California and wanted to 1031 exchange those into single family rental properties in Oklahoma, and those Oklahoma properties were like $200,000 to $250,000. Well, his sale was 2.5 million. So he was going to have to buy more than 10 to complete his exchange. So obviously the three property rule was not going to work for him. And so he used this rule called the 200% rule. And that rule allowed him to identify as many properties as he wanted, up to twice the value of the property that he sold. So he sold for 2.5 million. He could identify up to $5 million worth of real estate. And I think he ended up identifying like 24 properties, and ended up buying, I think, 13 of those 24 to to complete his exchange. So there are various rules that people can use to identify property. Typically, most people sell one property, buy one property, so they typically will use that three property rule. Property number one that they identify as a property that they really want to buy. 2 and 3 are potentially like backup properties.
Right. I think that, brings me to sort of my next question about, like kind of property, because it seems like there's also sort of confusion around what that means, right? As part of this, can you help clarify, like, what does that mean in today's market? I know you just talked about, one of the examples where, this person sold the asset for 2.5 and ended up, buying, like 13 of them in the end.
Yeah, yeah. It's like kind rules were really kind of more in place for personal property exchanges. So when I first started, and before 2017, people did exchanges for personal property. So like farming equipment, and I've done exchange for railroad cars and livestock, and all kinds of different things. In fact, the running joke in my office was I had figured out how to exchange everything with the exception of husbands and wives. But when the 2017 tax reform bill came into place, they eliminated 1031 for personal property. And the personal property like-kind rules were very restrictive. You had to buy things in the same asset class. So if you were selling, machining equipment, you had to buy machining equipment. So it was really restrictive. But with real estate, it's very wide open. So with real estate, it just says, are you, buying something or selling something that you held for investment or business use that was real estate? And are you buying something that is real estate that you intend to hold for investment or business use? So you could sell, vacant land, obviously buy improved property. I've got a client right now that's selling improved property, buying vacant land. I've got a client that's selling an industrial deal, buying residential. We have clients that sell apartments and exchange into triple net lease investments. So as long as what you're buying and selling is real estate, and as long as you intend on holding it for investment, at least initially, it'll qualify as like kind. So the rules are pretty broad when it comes to real estate.
Got it. And, and I'm guessing there's no, association with the amount of what you sell. I mean, does it also have to equate to, the value of, what you're exchanging?
The like kind rules don't really equate to value, but there is the reinvestment rules, and the reinvestment rules are pretty straightforward. They basically say in order to not pay any taxes, to defer all of your taxes from the sale into the new replacement property, you've got to buy something that is equal or greater in value than the net sales price of the property that you sold. Now, you have to be a little bit careful when we're talking about net sales price, because it doesn't mean net proceeds. So it's not net of the loan, it's net of closing costs. So things like, title insurance, escrow fees, real estate commissions, you can back out all of those standard non-reoccurring closing costs to get you to a net sales price. You have to go buy something that's equal or greater than that. You also have to reinvest all the proceeds. Now, you could do a partial exchange. So I have a client that emailed me this morning. They're selling an asset for about $3.5 million. I think after taxes or after commissions and everything, it's like 3.2 million. They want to buy something that's about 3 million. So they're going to be about $200,000 short. They can still do an exchange because they've got about $1.5 million gain. They're still going to defer taxes, but on the $200,000 difference between what they sold and what they bought, they consider that what they call boot, and that $200,000 would be taxable. So we do have clients that do partial exchange. We also have clients that, I had a client yesterday that wants to take some cash from the sale. You can do that. You're just going to pay taxes on that cash. It will lower the amount that you need to go replace. And so we do have clients that say, you know what, I want to take a little bit of cash off the table for whatever reason that might be. And you certainly can do that. You're just going to pay taxes, like I said, on that cash.
Got it. Got it. And that just, gets, taxed as regular capital gains, just
Yeah,
in the difference of the amount. Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Um, and, how does depreciation in that get captured?
So if you have boot, right, or if you've bought a property for less, they typically always tax you at the highest rate first, which is with recapture depreciation tax. Depreciation schedules, basically go from one property to the next. So your basis in your sale carries over to the future property.
Oh, sorry. I think yeah.
You
You,
still there?
yeah, I think you just glitched for a minute,
Oh,
but, can you
okay.
just repeat that?
Yeah, so the depreciation schedule carries over from your sale to your purchase.
Yeah.
So if you have like an apartment building where you've owned it for, let's say, 17 years, and you're on a 27 and a half depreciation schedule, so you have 10 years left remaining on that schedule. If you sell a property and buy a property that's of the same value, you basically just transfer that depreciation schedule over to the new property, and you just remain, to depreciate that over 10 years. Now you can gain depreciation if you buy a more expensive property. So if I sell something and go up in value, I can, basically, do that and then add that and take a new depreciation schedule. So let's say I sell for 3 million. I buy a new asset that's 4 million. Well, I take my old depreciation schedule, run it over to the new property, and that new $1 million difference is I get to add to my tax basis. And then I can take a percentage of that, which is considered improvement. So let's say the property has a 70% improvement value, then I can take that $700,000 and start a brand new depreciation schedule on that 700 and run those depreciation schedules side by side.
Got it. Very interesting. So in the end, you're actually paying less, in taxes using that strategy.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's sort of, shift a little bit to, I know you talked about, I think one of the important things is, identifying your sort of qualified intermediary or, QI, I suppose as they, call it, right? Like, um, what makes that role sort of a non-negotiable when we're doing a 1031, exchange?
So we kind of mentioned it earlier, which is the client can have control of the exchange funds during the exchange period. So if you don't have a qualified intermediary, then when the sale closes, the escrow is going to send you, or the attorney is going to send you the money, right? Which then invalidates your exchange. So the idea behind a qualified intermediary, an accommodator, a QI, or a facilitator, whatever you want to call us, is basically to act as a middleman between your sale and your purchase. We're also really good at making sure that you comply with the rules, because we understand 1031. So we understand what language to put into the contract, what language, goes into, the sale. Also, you make sure that you properly identify within 45 days. And then also on the buy side to make sure that all the exchange language is correct there. So, that's kind of the role of the exchange company or the qualified intermediary. They're there to kind of facilitate the transaction, kind of act as a middleman between your sale and your purchase, and make sure that you kind of qualify with all of the exchange rules.
Got it. Now, let's say, someone's committed to doing a 1031, but finding sort of that right, property or a deal that hasn't gone through for whatever the reason is. So finding the right replacement, has become sort of a challenge, and they're now hitting against that sort of 45-day mark. Like, what strategies can investors use to navigate this timeline? And especially when there's like a low inventory, or the prices are, too high, and, now they're kind of starting all over.
Well, I think the smart rule is kind of try to build extensions into your sale, right? Because that 45 days doesn't start until the sale closes on the relinquished property. So sometimes you can build in, extensions. A lot of times investors, especially if you're selling an investment property, they've done 1031s. Investors understand that, hey, this guy's in an exchange. He's going to be in that 45 days. And so they'll give you extensions. It's very common on, especially on commercial transactions, to have one or two 30-day extensions, because the 45 days is kind of a hard and fast deal. So like I had an exchange 2 years ago where I got under contract 5 days into my, 45-day, process. And it was an industrial deal. And my best friend is a lender. And he said, hey, man, you got to get a phase 1 environmental report to make sure that there's no environmental issues. And I said, well, I don't need one because the seller's going to carry back the financing. And he said, listen, you need to get it in phase 1. It's an industrial deal. You need to make sure there's no environmental issues. So I said, okay, fine. I agreed to do that. So that phase 1 took 30 days. And so I got the phase 1 back, and it said you need to get a phase 2. And the phase 2 was going to cost, the phase 1 cost like $2,700. The phase 2 cost $17,000. And so I went to the brokers who were clients of mine, and I said, hey, you got to go to the sellers and let them know I'm going to back out of this deal because I've got to make I can't wait. I've only got 10 days left to identify, and the phase 2 is going to take 45 days. And the people that own the building, their grandfather had built it. They were very nice people, and they agreed to pay for the phase 2. They said, listen, the building's clean. There's no environmental issues. We'll pay for the phase 2. And so I stuck in the deal because I'm like, there's no way that this seller is going to agree to spend $17,000 if there's an environmental issue, right? And so I stayed in the deal. And lo and behold, when the phase 2 came back, there was some environmental issues, so I couldn't buy the deal. And the problem is that now I'm 80 days into my exchange, and that was the only property that I had identified. So, that's why I tell clients you want to get things under contract and get your due diligence done early in the process so you're not butting up against that 45 days. Because, at that point, right, I'm 80 days into my exchange. I'd only identified that one property. I was forced to pay taxes. So, you don't want to be in that position.
Yeah, that's great. So I think, some of the strategies that you talked about earlier, having those, 3 property rule or, multiple, those, those in those instances will, I suppose help. Great. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, and I know we briefly talked about it, yeah, when we connected earlier, was, and this is something that, I was told. So, here we are talking about it, right? Like, especially when it comes to, title or, financing issues that you have. Like what have you seen, be usually the, cause of problems in these transactions? And when I say that, it's, like one of the things that I was told is that, if I buy a property, like let's say now, it's in my personal name and I want to now move it out into an LLC or into a business name. In that case, 1031 is not one that works. And we were talking about how it's possible as long as you do it right. Talk to us a little bit about, what that would look like.
So when you do a 1031 exchange, you want to make sure that the taxpayer that's selling the property is the same taxpayer that's buying the new property, right? So, where we run into most issues, especially in California and New York, are with partnerships. So like if you and I own a building together in an LLC, we decide that we want to sell it, but you and I decide we want to go our separate ways. We can't essentially do that because you and I individually don't own real estate. We actually own an interest in a partnership. And so in order for that, to work as real estate, right, we've got to basically dissolve the partnership, deed the property into a tenant in common structure where we're both basically holding title. And now once we're holding title, we can sell it and do an exchange. In California and New York, the state authorities, tax board authorities there, they don't like that transaction. They look at it, they call it a drop and swap because you're dropping out of the partnership and swapping into a tenant in common structure. And so their position is that, hey, you know what? We know that the LLC held this property for investment, but us as individuals held the property primarily for sale. And so properties held primarily for sale don't qualify for investment. And that's probably something that we should talk about with, holding periods. But so, typically most tax advisors, in fact, I was just emailing with some clients this morning about it. They want to see you hold the property for 2 years. And the reason before you sell it. So you basically dissolve the partnership, deed the property into a tenant in common structure, hold it for 2 years, and then you could sell it after that. And the reason that they have 2 years is because there's a revenue procedure that basically says any property that's been held as an investment for 2 years or more. In an audit, the IRS won't challenge the held for investment portion of the exchange, which means that, they can't basically kind of creates a safe harbor for a 2-year holding period.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, you're not seeing that issue in other states. So like in Texas or Florida or, Tennessee or any of those other states, if you do drop and swaps, it's no big deal. So when you're looking at, selling an asset and having to do an exchange, you just want to make sure that the taxpayer that's selling is the same taxpayer that's buying. Now, when you talk about selling a property individually, so let's say, I own a property as Greg Burns, and I go to buy a commercial property, and let's say I'm getting a loan, and the lender says, hey, we want you to form some sort of bankruptcy remote entity to hold title to it, like an LLC. Well, if I hold, the LLC as a single member LLC, where, it's in California, since it's a community property state, I can put myself and my wife as a single member in that LLC. It'll disregard the LLC for tax purposes. So it'll pass through directly to me. So the same taxpayer that sold will be the same taxpayer that buys. The LLC will be there for liability purposes and for legal purposes of holding title to the property, but for tax purposes, it won't exist. So, as a, kind of summary to what I'm talking about, make sure that the taxpayer that's selling, same taxpayer that's buying. It's not necessarily as important as who's on title, right? You have the Greg Burns Living Trust. Well, Greg Burns Living Trust is a pass-through entity, so Greg Burns is a taxpayer. I go to buy a new asset, and they want me to buy it in my own name, no problem, right? Where you also see issues are, we're seeing right now a lot of baby boomers are buying properties for their kids. So they're saying, hey, we want to sell this apartment building, and we're going to take a portion of this and use it to go buy a house for my son to live in. And my son's going to be my tenant. They're going to pay me rent. But the son the son wants to be on title. Well, you can do that, but remember that the parent that's doing the exchange, they've got to take enough of that property to complete their exchange. So let's say they sell an asset for $800,000. And they're going to go buy a house for their son for $1 million, right? Well, they've got to buy 80% of it as a tenant in common. They could add their son on for 20% as a tenant in common. And then the son's just got to pay them fair market rent for their 80%. So that is, a way that you can see it. And we're seeing a lot of parents doing that right now. And the reason is because real estate is just so expensive. These kids are having a tough time being able to afford a home. So it is kind of something that, a way that you can kind of utilize 1031 to allow them to exchange into a property that's more kind of personal use. But as long as they pay rent, I think they're okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess that's one way of, preserving some of that wealth as well, while it's still being used by, like the children. So that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people right now are thinking like, why am I going to wait till I pass away to give this to my kids, right? Why don't I help them now, so that I can see them kind of, enjoy it?
Makes sense.
I'm going to
Awesome.
try to spend all my money before I die. So I told my kids they better work hard.
Yeah. They're not going to find, like a treasure chest.
That's right. That's right.
All right. I want to pivot now a little bit and talk a little bit about, the passive side of 1031, versus what we've been talking about, in being like a tenant in common. Talk to us a little bit about, one, what is appealing, especially for passive investors, and largely large part of our audience is probably, keen on understanding what that looks like, and explain to us a little bit about what does a DST or a Delaware Statutory Trust, like, how does it work? What's the strategy that one should be thinking about in using that?
Yeah, so there are two real methods that people utilize to kind of become a passive owner of real estate. You have the Delaware Statutory Trust, and you also have triple net lease investments. And it's interesting, when I first started 25 years ago. I knew one guy in Encino who sold triple net lease investments, and they were only sold to institutional, kind of investors. Now I know more than probably 500 people who sell only that type of asset class. And so when you say, well, what's a triple net lease? You guys see them everywhere, right? You've got, Dollar Tree, McDonald's, Jack in the Box, Carl's Jr., Starbucks, CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, all of those properties, for the most part, are owned by an investor, right? So let's take Starbucks as an example. Starbucks is in the coffee business. Actually, I found out they're kind of in the sugar business, but they are, basically want to use their, revenue to open more stores. And they don't want to use it to buy real estate, right? So, but they do want to act as a true owner of their property. So they sign this thing called a triple net lease, which makes them responsible for the taxes on the property. So they pay the property taxes, they pay the insurance on the property, and they're also responsible for the maintenance in the property. So the client that owns the property, they just get a check from Starbucks. They pay their mortgage if they have one, and what's ever left over is there. It's not like apartment ownership where, hey, a pipe broke, you've got to send in a plumber, or there's someone that moved out and you've got to now turn the unit and paint it and get it all ready for the new tenant. So it's an interesting form of ownership. And I would say, people that are going into that type of investment, they probably are going to have, probably around $1 million at least of equity to try to kind of go into that market. Now, clients that are looking to maybe diversify, maybe they don't want to buy a single asset like a Starbucks because they're concerned that, hey, what if Starbucks doesn't like the store and they, the store, when the lease runs out, they don't renew it. And they would like to buy something and gets a little more diversity. There is this other thing called the Delaware Statutory Trust, where these real estate companies, these sponsors go out and buy typically large assets. They're typically like buying like a student housing development right across the street from USC is that one that just recently had done. There's another portfolio of like 16 self-storage facilities in Texas that you can buy a percentage interest in. So there's a company out of Pasadena called Exchange, right? They do triple net lease investments, but they do a huge package of them. So they'll put together like 30 different properties into a package, and then you buy a small fractional interest in all of those 30 properties. The idea behind that, is that, hey, if one of those tenants goes sideways, we have another 29 tenants paying rent. So you might lose a little bit of cash flow, but it'd be like owning a 30-unit apartment building, right? If you lose one tenant, you haven't lost all your income, right? You're just losing that one tenant. And so we see people going into those types of investments because they are passive. Now, the one thing that I will say with the DSTs that you kind of have to kind of keep in mind is I have a client that's doing an exchange with us right now that owns 18 different DSTs. So 18 different properties, but 10 of them are in different states. And so he has to file 10 tax returns in 10 different states. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful, but you can get a lot of diversity because I think the minimum on these deals is maybe $200,000 to $250,000 of equity. So if you have $1 million, you could essentially go into 4 different DST investments. So you could buy a small chunk of an apartment building. You could buy a small chunk of, triple net lease investments. You could buy a small chunk of, self-storage. You could buy a small chunk of medical office to really kind of diversify your portfolio. So they are an interesting type of investment. Now the DSTs, to be fair, right? These companies are going out there, they're buying these assets. They are, putting the financing in place. So you don't have to qualify for the financing. It's non-recourse to the DST owners. It's typically recourse to the sponsor that's putting the deal together. And so you are paying kind of a premium for that real estate. So they buy a portfolio of $75 million worth of real estate, and they're going to mark it up, and sell it back to the investors at 78 or 80 million, right? So that, they can make some money as well. So you're kind of paying for that, due diligence, you're paying for the financing piece, you're obviously paying for their expertise, and then they typically manage the asset and make some money on that as well. So, but it is, a good form of ownership. The key is, people always call me and say, what's a good DST company? And I'm like, there are several of them out there, but even a good DST company can buy a bad deal. So it's important that you look at each individual deal that you're buying so that you're comfortable in the real estate that you're buying, because each deal is different than the one in the past. So it's important to have someone that understands that product type, that can look at the deal and make sure that it's good real estate.
No, that's great. As far as, I just want to touch about what you mentioned earlier. You said, there was one of your clients who has like 10 different, DSTs and spread across different states. Now when it comes time to sell those, do they get to reinvest it as one, as one like 1031, or, put that again into another DST?
Yeah, so this client has 18 different DSTs and they have 10 different states. But
Oh, okay.
so they sell those deals typically every 5 to 7 years. Now, some of the companies recently are rolling them into their own REIT, which is a conversation we can have as well. But typically they sell those assets every 5 to 7 years. And when the property is sold, they can do an exchange. They can go buy more DSTs. They can go buy their own property. They can cash out. So it's just like selling a property. Now, obviously, if you split your investment, if let's say you sell, you have $1 million of cash and you split that up into 4 different investments, you took 250 and put it into 4 different deals. When you sell, you're not going to have that $1 million. You're going to have a piece of it, right? Because they're each individually in different deals. So at that point, you're kind of a little bit stuck in that DST deal. Otherwise, or maybe you're in a part of the country where you could go buy like, a small single family rental property. But that's one of the things about breaking it up into a bunch of different deals and diversifying, is that when they sell it, you kind of are limited maybe on options that you can go buy.
Yeah, especially if you want to go buy an individual asset versus,
Right.
putting it back into a DST, which makes sense
That's,
because you're not going to
yeah,
find anything for 250,000. You
right.
want to go find, a commercial property unless you go to, I don't know, like I'm sure there's a
Mars,
place in
the moon.
the
Yeah.
place where you can get like a single family for 250, but that makes sense. Yeah, let's talk about REIT. I didn't realize that we could actually 1031 into, REIT as well.
So yeah, so you typically don't see anyone, for the most part, exchanging directly into a REIT. There's it's 721 election, which allows, you to basically exchange real estate and defer taxes and get partnership operating units in a REIT. But we are seeing some companies out there. Exchange Right is one. There's a company called Ares. JLL has one. Cantor Fitzgerald has one where you're buying into a DST, right? So like Ares, they're a REIT. They take a couple properties out of the REIT, they sell them off to investors, and then they hold those assets for like 2 years. And then they roll that DST into their REIT. And then you get partnership operating units in the REIT. It's called a 721 election. Now you're sitting inside the REIT and you go, okay, well, how do I get out of it? Well, you can convert your partnership operating units into stock. And when you convert them into stock, you can then sell those shares of stock. And at that point, they become taxable. So you can sell off smaller pieces. It gives you a little bit more liquidity, where on the DST side, when you're in those deals, there's really not a secondary market. So it's
Yeah.
not like if you buy into a DST and you decide after 2 or 3 years, hey, you know what? I don't want to be an investor in this anymore. It's really kind of tough to sell your share in that property. Some of the sponsors will try to make an effort to do that, but you really got to look at it as kind of a long-term hold. Like, hey, I got on the bus in California, bus is heading to New Jersey, and I am, on the bus till New Jersey. And that's really kind of the mindset you want to have when you go into a DST. If they roll into a REIT, I think you typically have to hold your partnership operating units in the REIT for like a year before you can sell, which I think the general rule. Um, but then you can create a capital event. So you can, good question to ask those companies are, hey, like if I converted $500,000, if I was in the REIT and I'd been in it for 2 years and I converted $500,000, how readily available is that stock to be sold? Because a lot of the REITs that are doing this are not publicly traded. So it's not like they're sold on the open market. So they've got to, create a capital event to get you out.
Yeah, makes sense. So, obviously get, more information. Is that something that you guys, your company sort of advises on, or, that's really left to the operator?
Yeah, we really don't advise much on that. They're typically sold as a security through like a financial advisor. But if you, had somebody that needed help, we certainly could find somebody that gets some answers for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Now it's like the exciting, part about, just long-term planning, and, in a way like wealth preservation. And, you know, as far as the broader, estate planning, I know you kind of talked about it, briefly earlier.
Yeah.
Um, can you break that down? Like, break it down, like how can one move forward and say, okay, well, as part of like estate planning, I want to incorporate a 1031, into the strategy. And this is kind of what, is basically going to happen such that, like, the future generation probably doesn't have to pay, because it's not like, we're not paying taxes, we're just deferring taxes in a 1031.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's an important thing. I mean, is to remember that 1031 defers taxes are not tax-free exchanges. I had a client, it was a couple of years ago, they had sold off, one property, bought two properties. And then she called me like maybe a year or so after she had completed her exchange. And she said, Greg, I'm just wondering how long I have to hold these properties before I can sell them. And I said, do you want to do another exchange? And she said, no, I just want to sell them, cash out. I said, you can sell them anytime you want. She said, well, why would they let you do that? I'm like, well, why would they let you do what? She said, well, why would they let you do a 1031, go buy these new properties, and then just sell them anytime you want and not pay any taxes? I said, who said anything about not paying any? I didn't say anything about not paying any taxes, right? So the taxes are still there. You've just deferred them into the next property. Now, you can use it as a estate planning tool, which would allow you to basically exchange into a property at some point down the road. And then when you pass away, your heirs get a step up in basis equal to the fair market value at the time that you passed away. So, you 1031 exchange, we call it swap till you drop program, right? You just exchange throughout your lifetime. When you pass away, your heirs get a step up in basis. And if you like live in a community property state, they get a full step up. So like in California, you pass away, your heirs get a full step up to whatever the fair market value is. So then they can sell the assets and not pay any taxes.
Yeah. Just for our audience who don't understand what a step up is, talk to us about, like what is a step up?
It steps up the basis to the current fair market value, right? So if I, let's say, bought an asset for 500,000, and when I pass away, it's worth $2 million, my wife's going to inherit that property at 2 million, and that's what her tax basis is going to be. So she can sell that asset at 2 million, and not pay any taxes on it.
Yeah, perfect. That's awesome. That's actually a great way to incorporate, that into sort of just, long-term wealth preservation, like build that.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. I know we're, we have a couple of, things that I do want to kind of dig into, but I want to also, be mindful of, the time we have. So before we wrap up, I just want to, uh, hear from you, like, your best sort of advice, like what should, high income investors, who are thinking about selling any like, property, like what's a smart move? What should they be doing, and how should they be thinking about considering a 1031?
I think you want to look at I want to think, you want to look at a couple things. One is like asset management, where are you at in your investment cycle? Like I said, a lot of baby boomers are tired of, like the tenants, toilets, trash, termites, all the, fun, terrible T's that are associated with owning real estate and just kind of want to become passive investors. It's hard for them sometimes to make that jump. I mean, I was having um, lunch with a client yesterday. He's actually a business associate that works for the title insurance company that we're, a sister company with, and he owns about 25 properties. And he's getting to a point, he's, still, very active, but he's getting in a point in his life where he's like, I'm done kind of managing these assets. And in California and some other states, tenant rules can be really, really rough on landlords. And so I'm like, Anthony, why don't you exchange into these triple net lease investments, or put some money into DSTs and become a passive owner? And it's a little bit of a struggle for him because, a lot of these triple net lease investments are all over the country, right? And so he's a guy that historically has actively managed his real estate. He's been able to go out and kind of kick the bricks on it. And so I think that that's kind of a hurdle. And also, I think people are leery about triple net leases. They kind of, don't understand them. They feel like, oh, so this, what if the tenant goes, sideways? For the most part, most of those deals are pretty stable and the tenants are going to be there. I mean, let's face it, if you buy a McDonald's, they have better credit than the US government. So, they're not going anywhere. They're going to pay their lease. And so, I would say that, the key is to kind of evaluate your assets. I mean, just because you own, a property, if you're not actively managing it, you're not actively raising rents, you're not, rehabbing units and, trying to increase your rent, you may be at a point in your life where it's not a good idea for you to own apartments anymore. And so I think you need to look at those assets. Also, people, use the money to buy their vacation homes, right? Or their dream homes, where we got a client that I sold the property. They sold the property. It was an apartment building for about 4.8 million. And they wanted to take a little bit of the money, like 800,000, and go buy an investment property in Hawaii. And so they took 800,000 of the 4.8 million, bought an investment property in Hawaii. They held as an investment for 2 years, and now it's still a vacation investment property, but they utilize it for 3 months out of the year as their, kind of a second home. So there are lots of things that you can do with inside a 1031. The key is just to kind of make sure that you kind of understand what you're able to accomplish by doing it. And certainly clients are welcome to, obviously reach out to me. They can, call you and you can get them over to me. I'm happy to do that. But I think that you want to kind of evaluate your real estate. And just because it's highly appreciated doesn't mean that you're doing a good job managing it. It doesn't mean that there can't be opportunities out there for you to sell that asset and go into something that produces better income.
Huh. Yeah, I know that makes sense. Just finally, I want to, I know we kind of did touch about a lot of things, but I know there's like many myths out there when it comes to 1031, right? Like one of the things that we just talked about was, we're only deferring taxes. It's not like, it's a tax-free vehicle, right? What
Right.
are some of the other biggest sort of misconceptions that's out there or misunderstandings that's out there about 1031s, that you can say that we might have not covered? And then we'll get into sort of Q&A. The audience has, questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, people got to understand, like some people were like, try to do their primary residence. But I mean, there are times when you can kind of do that. Like I have a client that's like, they own a property that has an ADU that they rent out. And so they are exchanging that. I have a client like in Montecito where they bought a property for like $435,000, like 45 years ago as their primary residence. And now the property's worth $11 million. And they're trying to downsize, but they don't want to pay the taxes and they're not wealthy. I mean, obviously they're wealthy because of their house, but they're not wealthy people. And so that makes up a huge chunk of their net worth. And so they have moved out of that house, refinanced it, took out some money to go buy, their retirement home. And they are going to rent the house out for a couple of years and then sell it and then do an exchange on that house and buy kind of traditional, real estate. So I think that, there's a lot of misconceptions as far as what you can do with 1031. As long as you play within the rules, I think that, there's a lot of interesting things that can be done.
That's great. That's great. I do want to open it up now because we have like talked about just so many different, components of
Yeah.
1031, and I know we can kind of dig deeper into it, but we're going to be out of time. But I do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So if you folks have any questions, feel free to post it in the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to it. I know there's one here. I think there's a question from Mitesh who says, for example, if the total sell proceeds is 250,000 and exchange property value is 1.5 million, can I use those proceeds for down payment for exchange?
Yeah, so if you sell an asset for 1.5 million, you have $250,000 in net proceeds. You've got to take that 250 and then use it to go buy another asset that's roughly $1.5 million or greater. Obviously, you can back out a closing cost you had on the 1.5 million. So maybe it's not exactly 1.5, maybe it's $1.4 million after closing costs. So you take that 250 and you got to go buy something for, roughly $1.4 million or greater.
That's great. I don't believe there are any other, questions from the audience, at least at the moment.
Okay.
But oh, here's one. What is the difference between a DST and REIT trust? They're both
So
trusts.
yeah, so a DST is you're investing in the actual real estate. So you're going to buy, let's say it's 16 self-storage facilities in Texas. You're going to own a piece of those 16 properties. When you exchange into a REIT, the REIT might own 100 different properties, and you don't own an interest in any of those properties. You own a partnership operating units in the REIT, which then owns the real estate. So a REIT is, a real estate investment trust that basically owns a portfolio of properties, and you're investing in that company. You're not really investing in the real estate, but it does allow you, because all the underlying assets typically that a REIT owns is real estate. They have a special election that allows you to kind of, defer taxes into a REIT.
Yeah, that's great. I think, just from a, understanding these nuances and, knowing what you want to sign up for, right? Like, especially as a passive investor, I think that's great, super powerful. I am actually going to post your information in the chat for the audience if they want, to reach out to you. Again, Greg, thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
Sharing sort of your insights today. It was super helpful. I have so much to kind of, take away. I think Aziz had a follow-up. He says, would you say then REIT is a mutual fund?
It's not. A mutual fund is a fund that owns a bunch of different stocks. A REIT owns, real estate. So they own real estate investments, and then, they're basically like a lot of them are privately held or publicly traded, that are real estate companies. Basically, they buy and manage real estate, and you own an interest. Like you could go buy stock in a REIT, on the New York Stock Exchange today. So like Blackstone is a REIT you can buy, Essex is a REIT you can buy. So you could just buy stock in those companies. So, but it's DST is you're buying the real estate. In a REIT, you are owning basically stock. Now, I guess you could say it's like a real estate mutual fund, except a mutual fund typically owns stocks, and the REIT owns only real estate.
Yeah, no, that's great. Again, like I said, I have posted your, information for the audience.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us.
you
So
bet.
insightful. I'm sure, folks will be able to reach out to you directly if they have more, exchange related, questions. But if you folks want to learn more about Arcstone and how we can support you with your 1031 or help you explore sort of these passive investments through syndications, feel free to connect with us. We're always here to help. Thanks again for you folks to joining, and see you all at the next event.